All right, looks like we've got a lot of attendees pouring in. This is wonderful. So we'll go ahead and get started. Holly Cohen, Freight and Rail Planning Administrator with the Florida Department of Transportation Freight and Rail Office. I also have Liz Stutz with me. I'll let her go ahead and introduce herself. She's my co-host for the webinar today.
Hi, I'm Liz Stutz. I'm the State Transit Manager, and welcome to the webinar.
Excellent, thanks Liz. We also have our leadership on today, so I'll go ahead and turn it over to Brad Thoburn. Let's give us some welcome messages today.
Thanks, Holly. My name is Brad Thoburn. I'm the Assistant Secretary for Strategic Development at Florida DOT, and really excited to see a number of folks that have already joined us. I know we had a number more that signed up, so I'm hoping that number continues to grow. It's great for us to get feedback from the public and our partners, especially when we're talking about our modal partners. Obviously, we're in a little different role when we talk about our modes because we're not typically the owner or operator, but we are in the place where we are a funder, provide technical assistance, safety oversight, things like that. And so the partnership is key. And one of the things that a key observation is not going to be groundbreaking for anybody listening today, but the nature of mobility, as we know, is changing. And there's some things that we see at the state level, throughout the state, actually, in terms of the fact that we have a lot of areas where we're seeing a lot of growth throughout the state, but we're seeing increasingly high density areas where the highway expansion becomes difficult. There's a demand for more modal options. There's also a lot of opportunity for connectivity between our cities, not just within the cities. So at the city level, regional level, and the intercity level. And of course, Florida continues to have an aging population that demands mobility options. At the same time, the marketplace for mobility on the private side is changing. As you see innovations, new services, whether it's micro mobility, shared mobility, the TNCs, innovation and automation in various modes. And so the world of mobility is changing greatly. And so what that's forced us to do, in addition to sort of our regular updates of our rail plan, is to think about what is our role as it relates to our partners and how is that changing, because the world of mobility and the marketplace of mobility is changing. So these sessions that we're going to be having, virtual session today and then also in-person sessions, are going to help us better assess the department's role. We're going to update our rail plan. We're going to create a transit strategy that's going to really focus on how do we continue to effectively support our modal partners. What our funding priorities look like? What kind of assistance is needed to make our partners more agile and resilient? And how do we ensure that the investments we're making at the state level continue to be strategic in nature and really sort of move the needle? We're already doing a lot of things that we'll talk about, whether, I think a lot of you are familiar with the Vital Few, and so we're doing things that advance the Vital Few through our New Starts program and our DDR funding, and also changes to the SIS. So all that, I think, provides a foundation for our role in being a good partner and creating a vision for how we support you. So excited about the conversation today, and hopefully it continues to advance our efforts to improve mobility and strengthen the partnership that we have with all of you. With that, I'm going to hand it back to Holly or over to Kenyatta.
Just want to introduce myself. I'm Kenyatta Lee, Chief of Modal Development and Interim Chief of Staff for the Florida Department of Transportation. And we just wanted to thank you for participating during these listening sessions to help us to evaluate our next steps and get your thought as far as us planning for how we can make more mobility options available to our visitors and residents of our state. and also to capitalize on the fact that we are a multimodal organization, and that is something that we're pushing out to the forefront. We're much more than roads and bridges, and we want to ensure that we are getting the feedback that's necessary to help us in planning for the future. So thank you for participating in today's session.
Awesome. Thank you both. That was really helpful context on why we're here and why it's so important. So, you know, like our leadership just noticed, we've recognized that need for statewide passenger rail strategy, statewide transit strategy. Communities around the state are interested in advancing rail and transit. Like Brad also mentioned, we're updating the required Florida Rail System Plan. It just made sense that since these aspects are so intertwined, let's go ahead and ask for input to feed all three efforts at once. We've got a lot already underway. We're kind of working on a lot of these aspects right now. So it's really important that we have your input. We need that to effectively analyze the role, like we mentioned, what that role in transit could play as it impacts you. That's enhancing mobility in the state. That's connecting residents with jobs. That's bringing visitors to vacation destinations. That's, you know, going back to our kind of core mission of providing that equitable, safe, sustainable travel options and enhancing economic prosperity, preserving the quality of our environment and communities. Our leadership mentioned the timing is right. Our department policy initiatives like the SIS, we're updating a lot of that right now. We've got new federal funding sources from the bipartisan infrastructure law. And we've got those partnership opportunities that we mentioned as well. So all of that is kind of aligned to allow us to advance rail and transit in Florida. So ask them to go ahead and advance to the next slide, please, and we'll go ahead and get started. All right, so to further clarify our purpose, we're really looking to get input. That's kind of the main reason we're doing this series of regional listening sessions in the first place. We want input on our current rail and transit systems. How do you think they should function as part of a better integrated statewide and regional transportation system of the future? We want input on who does what, like we talked about, with roles and responsibilities of FDOT and our partners. And most importantly, by inviting our stakeholders into the process now, we're hoping to strengthen that collaboration so our state will be able to better advance cohesive rail and transit priorities in the future. Can we get next slide, please? So how are we going to meet those objectives? Here's our agenda for today. I'll keep kicking us off really kind of with this conversation on our statewide transportation vision, really link that to how it relates to rail and transit. And then we'll hear about our initial thinking on some of the department's role in advancing rail and transit, including some potential kind of strategy topics and success factors. And then we'll let you know about our upcoming regional listening sessions so you can attend in person and provide even more feedback. All right, so before we go any further, some housekeeping notes and discussion guidelines for today. So please note everyone is muted by default, just helps to avoid some disruptions. Please feel free to ask questions as we go. There's a question box. There'll be multiple opportunities to provide feedback via polls during the presentation. And you can also choose to kind of raise your hand in the GoToWebinar format, and we'll have people actually ask questions verbally at the end. So with that, I'll go ahead and ask the team, would you mind go ahead and pull up the first polling question? We'll give this a try. Excellent. We want to know a little bit more about who's here today. This will give us a chance to better align on how we do our outreach in the future and make sure we're kind of covering all of our bases. We'll give this a couple more moments, make sure we get everybody a chance to reply. We know there's probably a lot of people that fall in that other category, so that's completely fine if you don't see yourself on the list. Just a couple more moments to make sure we got everybody. All right, I think we've probably got enough time here if we're ready to go ahead and showcase our results. Let's see who we've got on the call today. Oh, there we go. Excellent. Got a lot of state, regional, and local government. That's great. We want to make sure we've got a lot of those, especially regional and local folks. You're your communities are going to be so important, so we want to make sure you're telling us your vision. And it looks like we've got a lot of other as well, and transit on that side as well. Great. Thank you. Let's go ahead and back to the presentation. All right, so just to wrap up some discussion guidelines, we'll do our best to answer all of our questions as we go, but we may need to do some deeper review, provide some additional responses after the fact if needed. And the team is taking some detailed notes to best capture your feedback. And we're also planning to have the presentation be posted on the website after the fact. So please make sure you're engaged in the conversation today and feel free to share the presentation after the fact with anyone else you think might be interested. Let's go next slide. All right, so let's go ahead and get this stage started for the discussion to kind of give you that context. So Florida's projected to add an average of 783 net new people every day between 2021 and 2030. So that'll get us up to about a projected 24 million by 2030. Most of that population growth is anticipated to be people moving to the kind of northeast, as you see on the slide there, the central regions and the south regions of Florida. As our population surges in kind of some of those key areas of the state, congestion and delay will only worsen unless our infrastructure changes to adapt. Brad mentioned that earlier. You can't build only highways and expect to kind of get rid of that congestion and delay. We've got to provide those choices. And next slide, please. In addition to our population, Florida's economy continues to grow. So here you can see some of the unemployment rates and how historically they were decreasing till the recent pandemic. And actually, we recovered those jobs lost in early 2020, but Florida residents can access nearly 400,000 or kind of 50 times more jobs in a 30-minute drive as compared to riding transit for 30 minutes. That's that jobs accessibility gap could be a potential strategy topic for the improvement of our rail and transit systems. Visitor growth has been steadily increasing as well, and until recent years is forecasted to continue going up. And we're committed to planning for that growth and the mobility options our residents and visitors will demand both now and the future. We've got some mobility trends here that shows kind of that increase in truck activity. That's a lot of you buying stuff and having the deliveries to your homes during the pandemic. We've got a decrease in transit ridership that was expected during the pandemic, but it really hasn't bounced back. Air travel has returned to pre-2020 rates. Like I said, the trucking and the air stats, they've bounced back after that couple years of disruption. What we really need to do is figure out how transit ridership is still lagging, and we need your feedback to figure out what would make this mobility choice more attractive. So these and other trends were taken into account a couple years ago when FDOT revised our transportation vision for the state. At the Florida Department of Transportation, our mission is to provide a safe transportation system that ensures the mobility of people and goods, enhances economic prosperity, and preserves the quality of our environment and communities. And in order to do this, our transportation vision focuses on these core group of goals shown on the slide. And while all impact rail and transit really, the FTP goals most relevant to rail and transit really kind of boil down to those transportation choices, enhancing Florida's communities, and reliable mobility. All right, so as Brad mentioned, one of the ways FDOT really looks to move the needle on achieving our transportation vision is to advance rail and transit. These systems move those large amounts of people and goods while reducing highway roadway congestion. That's that efficiency component. So developing these successful rail and transit systems can be complex, and it will require a lot of innovative planning, engineering, workforce development, and those partnerships are going to be crucial. But as we've shown here on the slide, rail and transit are so closely connected and they're integrated as well. It's exactly why we're getting input on all these aspects at once, because they're so intertwined. Passenger rail and freight rail share tracks and corridors, and they obviously must coordinate closely to ensure that efficiency and safety of operations for both goods and people, especially when they're on shared tracks. Passenger rail and transit share passengers who transfer from one mode to another depending on the journey. And that close coordination with agencies and providers to ensure that seamless travel experience is crucial. And that's what a lot of the users are demanding as well. So with that, I'll turn it over to Liz to go into details on that statewide transit system and our draft strategy recommendations.
All right, thank you very much, Holly. So you've heard us talk about mobility and modal choices and modal options extensively in the first part of this webinar. And for our transit strategy, we're looking at ways to have transit become even more of a mobility option than it has been in the past. And so as part of our strategy development, we've classified our Florida transit systems into 3 categories: urban, rural, and inner city bus. We have currently have 30 urban fixed route systems in Florida, which provided over 217 million trips in 2019. For rural transit, we use the Community Transportation Coordinator system to get our rural transit services out to those areas. And most of those CTCs either operate the rural service themselves or contract with the service provider. So that's how the rural market is currently being reached. And then there's inner city bus services. And inner city bus services are those services connecting urban centers with stops in rural communities. And it's a way for rural citizens and urban citizens alike to join a network of interstate travel, not just intra, through those connections. And so that's what we'll be talking about in our strategies. Next slide, please. We're seeing industry trends. There was declining ridership prior to the COVID-19 pandemic. There's also new mobility trends that are spreading that use technologies, micro-mobilities, mobility as a service, and mobility on demand. So transit is really experiencing a paradigm shift. While ridership is declining, there are so many more new forms of transportation for people to take advantage of. And what we're hoping to achieve with our transit strategy plan is to integrate these services and types of micromobility into the way that we normally deliver transit and mass mobility. So the constant evolution of transit is central to our thinking in the development of this new mobility vision for the transit office. Next, there we go. So we talked about having potential strategies for you to comment on and consider. And these are just a few of the areas that we're taking a look at. We want to spend time identifying and funding the development of high capacity premium transit corridors within our metropolitan areas. We're also looking at integrating technology and emerging mobility by researching these new technologies and supporting pilot projects, but not pilot projects just for the sake of testing a pilot, but actually establishing how these pilots can be woven into the mobility of a community and accomplish the types of things that we're looking to see. We're establishing standards and guidance for these emerging technology implementations, and we're removing barriers to support innovative mobility as a service and mobility on demand projects. And we also believe and want to investigate the idea of regionalism. We think that's both important in an urban structure and a rural structure. So for transit in rural areas, the department's strategies include enhancing access to activity centers, facilities, and services by understanding the needs of rural areas and agencies. And for inner city bus, we want to look at co-locations with other strategies, microtransit, TNCs, park and ride facilities, mobility on demand services, and mobility as a service. And so now we're going to switch. We've got a couple of more polling questions for you. All right, the first one, we'd like to find out how many of you are actually using transit and how frequently you do. I'll give you a couple of minutes to select your choice there. All right, everybody had a chance? All right, let's go ahead and see the results of this poll. And not unexpected results, I'm afraid. It's good to see that there are a segment of you that are using transit pretty regularly. But as we suspected, 72% has either only used it once in the previous year or never at all. Okay, and we have another polling question for transit. Let's go to that. And this question, we'd like to get at what it is that would make transit more attractive to you to use. What is it that's keeping you from getting on that bus as an alternative to getting in a car to make the trips that you need to make? So just take a second and respond to this polling question as well. We'll give you a minute to do that. And you can select as many of those that apply. We'll just give you just a minute more. All right, well, those weren't exactly brain teaser, stressful type questions. So let's see the results of this polling question. All right, more frequent and reliable service. That is something that we all seem to believe needs to improve. And then connections to new destinations and other transportation at 64%. Both of those are items that we would like to address in our strategy document. Better amenities as well. Yes, that's another good choice. Well, we appreciate you taking the time to answer those polling questions, and we're going to get back to the presentation part of our webinar today, and I'm going to turn it back over to Holly to start with the passenger rail discussion piece.
Thanks so much, Liz. It's really good insight into kind of what we need to improve. We're going to dive into a couple more details on passenger rail and kind of do a similar polling exercise. So I'll be intrigued to see if the answers are the same or different for these kind of two different systems. So the department is statutorily responsible for developing and implementing passenger rail program to meet current and future statewide mobility needs. Unfortunately, historically, our passenger rail initiatives have really just been driven by individual projects, things that kind of come up with individual community needs or politically, and it's just, we found that we're moving away from that. We really want to create a long-range vision, so it's all kind of connected. It's got a kind of strategic game plan to it, and that we really want to drive our passenger rail initiatives in a way that makes sense statewide. There are three types of passenger rail systems in the state. That's intercity passenger trains. Those are really kind of connecting those major population centers. That's both within the state and out of state. Commuter trains provide that regional level mobility. That's your Sunrail, your Tri-Rail. And we've got urban transit systems, rapidly moving people within their own metro areas. We've got a couple examples of those around the state as well. So our passenger rail vision really needs to support all three types of these systems and allow that seamless integration with both the local community visions and, like I said, that kind of statewide perspective of how we make it all work together. We also must integrate that passenger rail with other modes. You know, Liz mentioned that kind of co-location with different mobility options. That's true on the passenger rail to transit side as well. Really need to look at that way to strengthen the efficiency, that's safety, that's reliability of that multimodal transportation infrastructure. And in order to do that, we have to work with our public and private partners to develop those strategies that benefit us all. We talked about intercity, and currently we've got Brightline and Amtrak in that kind of bucket. And like I mentioned, Tri-Rail and Sunrail are kind of those regional commuter rail services. And a couple of those examples of urban systems are the Tico streetcar, Jacksonville Skyway, and Miami Metromover and Metro Rail. So we've got examples of kind of each of those types, and how they all kind of work together is really where we're trying to figure out how best to plan for the state. And how we do that is different for each of those different levels. So we felt it necessary to kind of break them into those buckets. Across the board, some trends that are impacting the passenger rail industry. We mentioned before, there's a whole new stream of federal funding opportunities becoming available with passage of the bipartisan infrastructure law. This is huge. Nationally, $66 billion is guaranteed to support passenger and freight rail. That significantly increases the investment in intercity passenger rail with $36 billion over the next 5 years. There's $24 billion will be eligible for kind of Northeast corridor rather than all systems nationwide, but there's an additional $22 billion going to Amtrak for replacing all of their obsolete assets nationwide as well. And a lot of it that we may have access to is $5 billion going for consolidated rail infrastructure and safety improvements. That's the CRISI grant program. FDOT and our partners have used that before, but we're really looking forward to additional funding there. Eligible projects for that program include those that focus on safety, technology, emissions reductions, congestion challenges, increasing ridership, intermodal connectivity, and workforce development. All good aspects. Another $3 billion is for crossing projects. That's focusing on safety and mobility. This has really been a critical priority for FDOT recently. So in other trends, we've got increasing demand, like Brad mentioned at the very beginning, for those sustainable modes. Modes that, like rail, that move those high volume of passengers, reduce that congestion, lower the carbon footprint. People are demanding different modes of transportation. Passenger rail is also statistically safer and more reliable when it operates on a fixed guideway. So those are some of those aspects where maybe it would make sense to do passenger rail to kind of compete against that highway and maybe other transit modes that may not have as much reliability if they're not on a separate guideway, or maybe they work together. So how would we potentially address that with some strategy kind of topic areas? Neither really the public Amtrak model nor the private Brightline model is really a good, simple, perfect answer for intercity passenger rail services in Florida. They really both have pros and cons. So FDOT is considering, you know, we've looked at this across our leadership, across examples. We need to figure out to develop a new hybrid model that really delivers intercity passenger rail service in Florida that leverages the best of both, really, the current public and those private models. One of the strategy areas we're thinking about including in this plan and our passenger rail strategy is work out how to preserve the right-of-way. That's along our highways and on our state-owned rail corridors. For that future intercity and regional passenger rail service, it's really crucial that we make those strategic acquisitions because we don't have the opportunity to do that every day. So the department must look at this aspect proactively to make sure we don't miss an opportunity that might be far more costly in the future. FDOT's leadership in the development of regional systems is critical. We found that when we started looking at lessons learned and complexities associated with a lot of those different multiple political jurisdictions and different local governments, we really need to help and kind of step in at that regional scale as well and enhance and supplement that local technical capacity to facilitate and kind of provide that technical expertise as well. So that allow for some consistency in messaging on those impacted railroads. And like I mentioned, you know, our level of leadership will vary depending on if the passenger rail service is that intercity, regional, or urban. And kind of on that continuum, communities will be taking on more and more leadership as it gets to closer to serving their local population. That's kind of what we're feeling for the how FDOT will lead those regional efforts. Ensuring those regional and local funding mechanisms are in place to support long-term operations before the project implementation begins. We found that that is a huge lesson learned on the commitment levels of the local region. We really need to make sure that the department considers how much more we would be able to do if we move away from supporting our existing systems almost entirely and really kind of allow FDOT to take the lead in growing our system in the state, getting that, helping get new passenger rail built. And the communities are kind of demonstrate that commitment with that long-term funding so they can seamlessly take it over once it's up and running and operating for a little bit. At that urban system scale, FDOT's role might be to more assist local governments in implementing those projects while balancing the needs for all modes and users across our multimodal system in the way that we would all of our other modes of transportation in the department that we manage. So with that background of kind of what we've come up with so far, let's go ahead and go to the polling and hear what you think. Got a similar set of questions here. So we want to gauge, how often do you currently use passenger rail? And we know this is not available across all areas of the state, but like we showed on a couple of those examples, there's at least a few opportunities in most areas of the state. So we're hoping we've got a couple people using passenger rail. We want to gauge, do you and how often? Give it a couple more moments for everyone to go ahead and vote. All right, I think that's probably long enough. We want to go ahead and see what our poll results are. Yep, as Liz mentioned, not unexpected that we've got pretty limited use of passenger rail. It's once a year. That's interesting that we've got a couple people that use it on a very sporadic basis, but a lot of never, which is expected. And once a month sounds about right for kind of the spare event every now and then. That's great. Good insight. All right, let's go ahead to our next polling question. We want to ask a similar question on how do we improve? How do we get you into passenger rail to make sure this is a mobility choice that would be convenient and competitive against other choices? And this is another one where you can select all of these opportunities that apply. You know, as your main priority that you want to connect to new destinations, other transportation. We talked about those connections to other modes. It sounded like with transit, more frequent and reliable service is most important. That would make sense, but you know, maybe on the passenger rail side, you're looking at more regional travel, intercity travel, your timelines may not be quite as locked in. There may be a little more flexibility there. Is convenient and affordable payment options most important? Are you worried about safety and security? Better amenities overall, would that make the difference? We'll give it a couple more moments. All right, I think we're ready to go ahead and see what the poll results look like. There we go. So we got connections to new destinations or other transportation. That's excellent to hear. That's something that we're looking to get insight on today and in our upcoming in-person regional listening sessions on, you know, what new destinations, what other transportation connections are you looking for? Those are really good, impactful feedback things that you can give us some input on. And yes, we're aware more frequent and reliable service would absolutely be an area we're looking to expand into, but it looks like we've got some good input that convenient, affordable payment options and safety and security and amenities are all important as well. So none of these are really off the charts for anyone in particular. That's great to hear. I think we're also going to actually go ahead and just go straight into one freight rail question, just to get your input while we're on the polling side. Let's go ahead and bring that one up on the top freight rail priority. Just to avoid hopping back and forth, we wanted to go ahead and get your insights now on top freight rail priority. I know many people are slightly less familiar with freight rail as they aren't often direct users. So we left it at the one polling question for our statewide webinar. We're definitely going to be relying on that one-on-one interviews with our freight railroads, shipping partners to provide that additional insight. But we also want our potential freight rail users to share their feedback today and in our upcoming regional listening sessions. A lot of good input on where we grow this one as well. All right, I think we'll go ahead and look at the poll results on the top freight rail priorities as well. Safety, great. Capacity, number 2, close second. Excellent. Those are both aspects where we can get some really good input from you. You know, where are those safety concerns that you are aware of? And same thing on future capacity as it is on the passenger rail side. Where do you want to see that growth? All very important. And funding, absolutely. That's a key area we can't get away from on any aspect of passenger rail, freight rail, transit. All of funding is crucial to all of that. All right, excellent insight. Really appreciate that. We can go ahead and back to the presentation. And since we went ahead with the freight rail polling question, we can jump right into the freight rail slide of the presentation to kind of jump into some additional detail there, the same way we did on the passenger rail side. Give it a moment to get back to the slide, but essentially, you know, Florida's passenger rail broken into those 3 separate sections. The same way we've broken them into the 3 levels. Freight railroads are also classified into 3 different classes based on that operating revenue. And hopefully when we get the slide showing up in a moment, you really kind of see on our statewide map that Florida's freight system is operated by 2 Class 1 railroads. That's CSX Transportation and Norfolk Southern, 1 Class 2 railroad, that's Florida East Coast Railway, and multiple Class 3 railroads. Those are all the smaller ones that are further categorized as either switching railroads, terminal railroads, or short line railroads. But looking at the map, roughly 60% of the rail mileage in the state is owned by CSX and FEC. So while we talk to all of our partners on a pretty regular basis, we definitely touch base with our partners at CSX and FEC pretty much daily at both the statewide level and the district level. It's helpful that we've got our both rail coordinators and freight coordinators and actually transit coordinators as well, all at that district level. So that's helpful to gauge what's going on at the local level with our freight railroads. And then we also have that kind of consistency element of having some statewide coordination as well. So we're having that consistency across the state. So now, there we go. Thank you. You can finally see the map. We've got nearly 3,000 freight track miles in the state, and that carried 78 million tons of cargo in 2019. So definitely a lot going on in the state. Some general trends. So on an exciting note, we're seeing that freight rail and passenger rail both are coming together to kind of form some innovative partnerships that are benefiting both parties. They're finally kind of seeing that, you know, while it's happened strategically in the past, there's a lot of collaboration between freight rail and passenger rail as they're seeing the benefits to both parties lately. Some good examples of that are Northeast Corridor, and that's in kind of the Boston to DC area. That's a really good example of how they're working together to make sure the needs of both sides are being met. Another change, there have been many railroad mergers lately, line sales in recent years. That's really looking to improve some operating bottom line kind of measures. And if that means they need to consolidate, great, there's been a lot of that going on. As with other modes of transportation, the freight railroad industry is taking advantage of emerging technology opportunities. So everybody's looking to lower their costs in the supply chain. That's still true with the recent pandemic and supply chain crises that have kind of fallen out of realizing where those fragilities lie. Everybody's looking to operate safer and in general reduce their carbon footprint. So in the same way we did some kind of topic areas for our strategies on the passenger rail side, we're looking at these for the freight rail side. Freight rail is privately owned and operated, so that provides that kind of complexity. but there's really areas of common interest between the state and our railroad partners. And that's actually why we asked your top freight rail priority, because those are the 4 topics that we heard from our freight railroads that are kind of the core elements that they're looking at: safety, liability, capacity, and funding. So we're considering some strategies on each one of these areas. On the safety side, operations continue to conform with the Federal Railroad Administration's regulations. That's everything has to govern the safe operation of railroads, as well as host rail safety, and they have to follow their operating rules as well. FDOT has rail safety inspectors. They supplement that Federal Railroad Administration, the FRA staff, to ensure all railroads are following all their rules and regulations. But on our side, Operation Stride, FDOT completed an installation of 620 dynamic envelopes across the state 8 months earlier than the scheduled completion date. That really was an effort to better alert drivers when they're nearing tracks. Hey, this is a kind of safe envelope. Over the past 10 years, Railroad Hybrid Grade Crossing Safety Improvement Program has decreased the total number of crashes by 59%, fatality crashes by 80%, and serious injury crashes by 66%, and property damage only crashes by 47%. So it's obviously having a great impact. So there's definitely some aspects that we can continue to look at on the safety side. On the liability side, really, anytime you add new passenger trains on host railroad infrastructure, there are new liability risks. So when we're considering these options, host railroads would typically require agreements that indemnify the host railroad from all liability issues involving the added passenger rail service. That's pretty standard. So that would include the incidents when the host railroad is at fault. And really, the department has a lot of experience in this area with prior Sunrail and Tri-Rail negotiations. So we'll continue to add some of those components on how we address those strategies. On the capacity side, anytime we have sufficient track capacity, you really need to identify sufficient track capacity to enable a passenger rail service to operate on schedule and not impair existing and forecasted operations of current track users. So like I mentioned before, it's a common misconception if there are tracks where passenger service is desired, you still need to consider if capacity is going to be met. And that's not as easy to gauge as, say, the number of cars using a highway. And this issue is especially critical with the passage of the Passenger Rail Investment Improvement Act. That's the PRIA, which made host railroads legally responsible for enabling tenant passenger trains to run on schedule. So they have their own needs that they have to abide by. We can't just add passenger rail service, even if it feels like it could be easily added. On the funding side, this is, like I mentioned, super critical across the board. Any agencies seeking to operate passenger service on host railroad infrastructure, their role should be to bear those costs associated with the implementation of new service. That makes sense, including the capital cost of capacity improvements and anything needed to reliably support the new service on host railroad trackage. That means we would be taking on a lot of costs to upgrade the existing infrastructure to make it so it could be have that capacity to serve both freight and passenger needs. In addition to kind of those 4 common areas, we've got some additional strategies under consideration. So that's in general just how do we provide new rail access to intermodal facilities. We talked about that kind of co-location factor on the passenger side. That's also true on the freight rail side. We need to make sure we're making those connections with intermodal facilities, freight activity areas, transloading facilities. And in general, another aspect of strategies is just promoting economic development. We realize that it's tough to find the public component of the benefit for the state when you're providing funding to private railroads, but we definitely find that the economic development components and some of the other benefits are absolutely worth it for the state and provide that overall public benefit as well. All right, so we know that's a lot to digest, but we really wanted to give you at least a taste of some of the draft content we've developed so far. And today's webinar is really only the beginning. This is our kickoff. So we've got 6 in-person listening sessions planned for the coming weeks throughout Florida. So these sessions will have kind of a similar overview of our vision and trends, but we're really going to dig into more detail, want more direct input at a couple stations designed to capture an input on a number of potential strategies we discussed today, and similar kind of polling questions of, give us more detail on where are those new transit services or rail connections desired? Where are those safety concerns that you're identifying? What can we do to improve? We'll have a little more hands-on opportunities to provide some more specific insight. We'll also plan to have a closing virtual session at the end of this effort, and that's where we're kind of TBD on the timing, but we really want to make sure we have time to take what we all heard at each of those regional listening sessions, kind of bring it together into a summary of what we've heard from you, provide another chance to react to those draft strategies and kind of hear what were those recurring topics we heard across the state, what were kind of some concerns and challenges that were unique to a particular region. We'll have a little more detail on that. And in general, please visit the website on screen for more information and to register. Register is not required, but we want to kind of get that RSVP to help us gauge approximately how many people to plan for. All of that's really helpful for making sure we're ready to hear from you effectively. All right, so at this time, I know we've got a lot of questions pouring in, which is great. We're going to open up for questions from the audience. I'll ask Shantanu and the rest of the team, please go ahead and help us identify any questions that have already come in for me and Liz and anybody on the team to address. And I know I mentioned raising your hand on the GoToWebinar platform, but actually this particular version does not allow that. So please stop looking for it. If you're looking for that feature, just please use the questions box and we'll absolutely make sure we can start asking some questions and getting some input. Thank you. All right, so Shantanu, would you manage to see if there's anything that you want us to go ahead and start with?
Sure. So there is a question, Holly, and I think this may be a Liz question.
Okay.
The question is, transit ridership has been declining for the last couple of years. How is that impacting the industry?
Well, that is a very interesting question. Yes, it is true that ridership was declining prior to the pandemic and has not rebounded from the drastic loss of riders during the pandemic. I think it's affecting the transit industry in numerous ways. There's the public perception of empty buses riding down the road, which is hurting the idea that transit is a good connection and a community service. It's also impacting the ability of transit systems to attract employees so they can expand the services in a community and the frequency and the types of things that people are looking for. So as a whole, the ridership declines have affected the bottom line, affected the ability to provide services, and affected the ability to have transit be a community connection.
Awesome. Thank you, Liz. There is another question, Holly, and this one may be for you. When is the kickoff meeting for the state rail plan? It is important that projects be included in that plan in order to be considered for funding.
Excellent question. Thank you, Shantanu. I guess this would be technically considered the kickoff meeting for our rail system plan outreach. Like I mentioned, we're going to have one-on-one interviews with each of our kind of core partners. That's our railroad, that's on the freight side and the passenger side. We're going to have some interviews with some core shippers across the state. We're going to have these regional listening sessions coming up in 6 different areas across the state. So we're definitely going to have lots of opportunities for input. We're also going to have the virtual closing webinar that I just talked about. And really kind of once we wrap up all that good input, hear from all of our one-on-ones, kind of wrap up all that information into here's what we've heard. You're right, we're definitely going to move into that. Let's go ahead and start establishing short-term and long-term needs, and that's project lists. And that's where we get into making sure we've got all of those needs identified. So when we go to apply for state funds for those federal grant opportunities, if we list those needs in the plan, that shows that continuity, that shows that we've kind of had that consideration in mind, and it's much easier to make sure we're set for those opportunities, that it shows that we've kind of considered those. So we'll be collecting those needs as part of those one-on-one interviews, and we'll definitely be taking into account anything we hear from the public in those regional listening sessions. And we're also going to be monitoring, we'll get to that on next couple of slides, a couple of general email addresses so we can get that input from the public as well as we're continuing to still build the plan. And then when we get to a point where we've got really kind of a solid draft that we're ready to have everybody get some much more detailed comment on, then we'll absolutely do a public comment period as well, where everybody will have one final chance to say, hey, here's what we've heard from our numerous chances for input from so many different parties. And knowing that we've had a lot to kind of bring together from all those different parties, we want to make sure that we heard the right things from every group. So that'll be another chance for us to make sure we got it right, that we've got all those needs identified, that we've got all those projects listed. Yes, we'll definitely have lots of opportunities, and please do share either via that general email address for rail projects or in one of our upcoming regional listening sessions. Please share those project needs to make sure we capture them.
Awesome. Thank you, Holly. So there is another question, and this may be, if Brad is still on, maybe it's a good one for Brad. But if not, maybe you can answer this. So which model is better for intercity passenger rail in the state, the Amtrak model or the Brightline model? I don't know if Brad is still on. Brad is still
I
on?
believe Brad is still on. I'll let him give a shot at it if he wants, and then I can elaborate if he, oh, there he is, wonderful.
I'm still on. That's a good question. I think the two models are very different, and they tend to, I think, serve different markets even. One is the publicly subsidized model with less frequent service and more stops, and it's a little slower, but it's a little more affordable. I know Amtrak, will probably say they're trying to look at how to change that model a little bit, be a little more competitive, and they're looking at opportunities to partner with states through the state partnership program for quarter service that may be a little more frequent and maybe more tailored to a local market. And one of the challenges for us is that the Amtrak service that comes in to the state is part of a much longer corridor that runs up through the Northeast. So the service may not get there as reliably and as frequent, and not always, the service may, the timing of the service isn't necessarily as ideal as you would if you had sort of a quarter-based service. And then you look at Brightline, which is going to have much more frequent service, faster, with fewer stops, but it's also a more of a premium service. So they're very different. The markets, even if, frankly, if they're in the same quarter, they're probably still different markets. And so, what we've talked about is there frankly something in between those, because they do seem to be, kind of both ends of the spectrum, and Brightline's working in places where the market supports it. And so it's an important question. I know that's a little less of an answer than kind of, sort of expanding on the question, but it's one of those that we're looking for input on. We've been very good at, I think our relationship with Brightline's been very positive, and that, we are working with them on the opportunity for leasing the I-4 corridor to expand from Tampa, from Orlando to Tampa, but we're not quite there yet with that. But we do have a successful, at least start with the Miami to Orlando project that's under construction. So again, not as much an answer as, we are looking for that guidance, and we are open to the conversation about is there some other model that makes more sense.
Yeah, thank you, Brad, so much. So I guess the next one is very interesting question and very timely as well. It's about EV charging infrastructure and funding. And essentially the question is, what is the state doing regarding that? So I don't know, Dana, if you want to take that one, Dana.
I think April might be on. April, do you want to get that one?
Hi, this is April Combs. Thanks, Dana, for that. So right now, the state of Florida is actually doing a lot. So last year, we released the Florida EV Master Plan, which looked at both short and long-term trips as well as emergency evacuations and what the state can be doing as far as planning. So that laid a great base for actually what we're doing now. As part of the bipartisan infrastructure law, states are getting a total of $5 billion for EV infrastructure. Of that, Florida is going to be getting $198 million over 5 years. So this first year, we're looking at approximately $29 million. But before states can use any of that funding, we are required to submit a plan to the federal government on how we are going to implement that funding. So right now, FDOT is using the EV master plan that we released last year. We're also working with state agencies. We've already started meeting with the Florida Public Service Commission, the State Office of Energy, as well as the Florida Department of Environmental Protection to gather, existing resources, as well as, planning efforts. We also have a stakeholder meeting that we're kicking off this week to determine more resources as well as engage our stakeholders. The plan is due this summer, but we've got a pretty aggressive schedule kicked off as far as our plan and engaging stakeholders. But overall, again, let me repeat, that's $198 million over 5 years. And we're going to be putting that on designated alternative fuel corridors in the state for high-speed charging.
April, thank you so much. April, there is a follow-up question to that. Where can we find the EVMP?
It is on the department's website under the policy and planning section.
Thanks, April.
My pleasure. Thank you.
All right, very good. So the next one is really in form of a comment, but I think there is a question, or I guess there is a reaction that's being asked for. And then the comment is that FDOT should purchase all freight rail corridors. This should be public right of way for public use. So, Holly or Brad, any reaction to that comment?
Can you repeat that?
Yeah, I haven't seen that question yet. That's interesting.
Yeah, so comment is FDOT should purchase all freight rail corridors. They should all be public right of way for public use. That is the comment.
Well, I don't, I think we've had some strategic acquisitions where freight rail usage was down. Obviously, Sunrail is one, and then we had the Tri-Rail corridor. So I think, the state's place in acquisition of rail is going to be more focused on those strategic opportunities. I'm not even sure legally, you know, there's probably not only financial limitations on purchasing all freight rail corridors, but I think there's also some legal limitations there. We have the ability to do that. So
Yeah, that's what I was going to bring up. I'm not sure we have the funding to do that and also do anything else.
So, but we had our relationship with the freight rail lines has been one of collaboration, and when there's strategic opportunity, we've been able to work with them. And I think that's, as we move to the future, that will continue to be the case.
There are states who own and operate their own freight railroads. Thus far, like Brad mentioned, that's really not been our model. But I do think it would be appropriate to hear your feedback on, what you think and why. So all of these comments are appreciated, and thank you for that. But there are some limitations on, like Brad mentioned, financially and legally with a couple of suggestions. So we want to hear all of your input, and we'll figure out what makes the most sense with all of your input in consideration.
All right, thank you very much. I think the next one, local government struggle with O&M funding for premium transit. Is FDOT considering providing any help?
Local governments struggle on finding funding for premium transit. The department is looking at different ways we can assist local governments developing high capacity transit corridors. We're looking at a staggered scale for assistance with operating when they do develop high capacity corridors. There's different options that the department can look at to assist. We're also looking at the options of increasing transit services on parallel corridors to the state intermodal system. So any ideas or any suggestions that any of the attendees want to provide during our listening sessions, we would be absolutely pleased to hear and see if we could somehow make them one of our strategies or opportunities.
Thank you, Liz. Brad, anything to add there, Brad?
Well, I think Liz caught, kind of the realm of what we're working on pretty well. I do think what we have recognized is, we made some changes to our New Starts program, changes to DDR. We're not going to take over long-term operations, but we may kind of bridge the gap a little bit, help folks kind of get to, initial operating support. The other thing we've recognized is in looking at a high capacity transit corridor program is that some of these corridors are really fundamentally important to the network, but they may not rise to the level of a CIG or New Starts funded project. But that may be a place where we can help develop them, help the development of those corridors short of going into a New Starts project or a Small Starts project.
Thank you, Brad. Looks like we have another question here. Has the department worked with freight railroads in the past to introduce passenger rail in their corridors? Holly or Brad or whoever wants to take that one.
I mentioned briefly that, yes, we definitely have experience kind of working on those negotiations with kind of our two biggest freight railroad by mileage owners in the state. That's CSX and FEC on the acquisitions and operations agreements needed. There's a lot of kind of interactions with both CSX and FEC on that south corridor with Tri-Rail. And, as we've just mentioned recently, looking at those corridors in the last several years where that freight activity had started to wane and it made sense to make that strategic acquisition. That's when FDOT came in and bought that corridor through Orlando that was CSX owned, worked with them to figure out what makes the most sense to shift that to passenger rail and kind of make sure that those freight operations still kind of continued around the city, but also could still serve those freight clients in the Orlando area after you kind of have a lot of that off system time in the evenings and things like that. So we've definitely got a lot of those relationships already. Like I mentioned, those kind of relationships are crucial for working through those types of questions, but we've got some of that experience. That's where FDOT can help take that lead on facilitating those negotiations if there's communities interested in doing passenger rail in the future. Brad, you want to elaborate?
Well, I think a lot of times people recognize that we bought the corridor for Sunrail. What I think a lot of times is not well known is that the proceeds from the sale that CSX used to enhance the diversion of freight off of that corridor. And the department has continued to make investments that support those kind of the diversion of freight so that it enhances the passenger rail service on that corridor. So that, you know, the purchases kind of got the attention, but there's a lot of work, a lot of improvements that have gone into ensuring that the freight the freight and passenger rail traffic is complementary. All you need,
All right, thank you very much. So there are a number of questions that came up that are related to sort of rail possibilities in the Tampa Bay, St. Pete, Clearwater region. And just, you know, generally, most of the comments are wanting to know what are some of the possibilities in terms of passenger rail in that area.
You want me to take a crack at that? We had a really great session. We had a great session in December with a lot of the partners and the Suncoast Transportation Planning Group to, you know, just kind of put the question on the table, talk about what the department's role is, some lessons learned, things like that. And it was actually kind of the kickoff to this hour. I think there are a lot of lessons learned from Sunrail, and each community is going to be different depending on what track you have. Does it, you know, reach to the right population centers, and is it part of your long-term vision, and is there capacity? And keep in mind that you don't always have to buy the track, but you do have to coordinate with the freight rail provider, because there may be capacity that would enable passenger rail service, but it may not, maybe in the form of a track fee or something like that, that allows passenger rail service. I think some of the things that I would offer is lessons learned from Sunrail. But the biggest one is that they had broad community support. Now, not that it wasn't controversial, but there were some real strong leaders in the community to help make that happen. They also had the commitment to support long-term operations, and they had sort of the stars aligned, and you had you know, some strong businesses lining up behind it, and so again, I think that was a good model. I mean, it's not perfect, but you know, if you kind of take that lesson of how Sunrail happened. The mechanics may be a little different depending on your location. But again, I think I kind of look back and see what happened there as a good model.
Great, thank you, Brad.
Agreed. That's all I was going to say too, is it kind of depends on what the community wants. That's what we're trying to hear from you in our regional listening sessions. You know, as Brad mentioned, it was an entertaining, helpful coincidence that they reached out to us and wanted to talk about commuter rail. And they didn't even know that we were planning to kind of do these outreach sessions coming up anyway. So it's just like we said, that, you know, everything's coming together. Everyone's kind of starting to demand these type of mobility options. And just like Liz said, you know, it may make the most sense where we're figuring out what is FDOT's role on getting them up and running, figure out what the local commitment is going on for operations and maintenance. All of those questions are going to be something we want to hear from you, what your needs are. Then we want to figure out whose role is it to do what.
Awesome. Thank you, Holly. Thank you, Brad. So this next one is for Liz. And the question is, how is FDOT assisting rural transit grantees?
Well, the department has a long history of assisting our rural transit grantees. We provide contracts that they can purchase vehicles off of, and that cuts down on their administrative costs associated with developing those purchasing contracts. It also gets them a cheaper, safer vehicle. We also provide operating assistance in conjunction with the federal government to our rural transit partners. But as we move forward with our strategy sessions, we're looking at ways that we can expand technology assistance to our rural agencies, whether it be through software packages, technology pilots, on-demand services, all of those types of things as we figure out what works best in each of our rural communities, because just like our urban communities, no two rural communities are exactly alike. So all of those strategies will play into how we assist our rural communities moving forward.
Excellent. Thank you, Liz. So this next question, what are some of the passenger and freight rail funding opportunities included in the bipartisan infrastructure law? I know Brad likes that question, but Holly, if you want to take that one, maybe. Either way.
Either is fine. I brought up a couple of these points during the presentation, but you're absolutely right. There's so many different opportunities. It's worth, getting into a little more detail. We've got $66 billion guaranteed to support passenger and freight rail. That's huge. That's an increase in the investment in passenger rail for sure. That's $36 billion over the next 5 years. We talked about how some of that is only going to be eligible for Northeast Corridor, but we may be able to have at least some aspects where we're eligible for increasing our intercity passenger rail opportunities. And a lot of that money also goes to Amtrak. And we're actually working with Amtrak, like Brad mentioned before, on kind of working out, what makes sense for the future of the state when it comes to those state options. Amtrak's new Amtrak vision, they were advocating for enhancing service in Florida. What does that look like? That's something that we'll need to work out in partnership with them. Those investments in passenger terminals, the investments in the leases for some of those opportunities, all of that we need to work out. I mentioned that we've taken advantage of CRISI grant program before. There's $5 billion of that federal funding goes to the CRISI is Consolidated Rail Infrastructure and Safety Improvements Program. That's a lot of the across the board elements that we're really looking at addressing every day. That's safety, that's technology, eligible projects on emissions reductions, congestion challenges, increasing ridership, intermodal connectivity, and workforce development. Pretty much all topics that we've covered numerous times today. So all of those would be good opportunities. And I mentioned before, another $3 billion for crossing projects. We're really working on rail safety, and that's going to be a crucial element to make sure that this mobility choice is attractive and works in coordination with all of our highway users, our rail users, our transit users, the bike ped community, everybody. It all has to work seamlessly, and safety is a huge component of that. And when we start having those conflicts between uses, that's where something like a crossing project can get a lot of bang for your buck there. Brad, anything to elaborate?
I think you got it. The state partnership program is the one that's kind of that $12 billion. There is a little bit of, there's like the Northeast Corridor money, and then there's the national network funds. Yeah. And there's a little question about what opportunities are there as it relates to the national network funding. So I think some of that will become a little more clear to us as they develop their programs.
Great point. Some of that guidance is kind of still TBD, and if Florida would eventually join into some of those kind of multi-state compacts that are more, that may open up some additional opportunities as well. Great point.
Yeah, and I think so. People we sometimes sort of skip over, but the corridor-based service is under 750 miles. So that's sort of, I've always kind of aligned the corridor-based service with the state partnership program. That may not necessarily always be the case, but I think that's Amtrak's read on it at least.
Yep.
That's true. As a reminder of the scale, those intercity passenger trains connecting those large kind of city pairs and regions, that's long distance. So yeah, there's kind of different questions there on what kind of population would.
All right, very good. Thank you both. There is another question, and this may be a Brad question. What are some of the investments FDOT can make to improve connectivity between freight railroads and other modes of transportation, such as seaports or trucking? So some of the intermodal type investments.
Yeah, well, that's great you asked that. We were having that conversation the other day. We were talking about what constitutes intermodal hubs, and it could be transit at an airport or rail at the airport, but also could be an intermodal logistics center. And we've had conversations about ILCs for years. It's for decades in Florida, and haven't quite, the private sector really drives that. But we do ultimately see the opportunity for helping with intermodal connections. We do have an intermodal program, and we have intermodal funds that we use for that purpose. And we're supporting things like on-dock rail and rail connectivity to our seaport. So that's as we talk about supply chain, that's a key link and something that we do invest in today, and I think we will going forward need to develop a more focused strategy as it relates to the development of ILCs.
All right, thank you, Brad. So there is a question about the regional session listing and the date, so we can go back to the screen and just share that slide. Another question about, are feeder bus services considered part and parcel of a rail plan? Holly, you want to take that one, Holly?
We can tag team that one, Liz. That's exactly one of the reasons we brought in the transit team this time around, is we find that, we can't plan well for our rail system if we don't have those connections in mind. So absolutely, that's going to be part of it. Brad alluded to some of the options we have for making those kind of connections on the intermodal side. That's on, the stations, the terminals themselves. That's, the on-dock, the near-dock rail for the freight side, and some of those intermodal ILC options. We have strategic intermodal system funds that we can do for the rail side and for the transit side. And those kind of needs identified need to be collaborated, absolutely. So that's something we'll be taking into account in the rail system plan. And kind of how we do that and what kind of input we get is going to be definitely something that we kind of capture a lot and do an additional analysis in the rail system plan. And that's something that we'll continue to kind of relook at and ask for those updated needs every year, like we do to make sure we're funding our programs. So Liz, anything to elaborate on there?
Yes, and Holly's correct. I mean, without those connections, you're missing the boat or the bus or the train. But what we're getting at too is that it's not just traditional feeder bus services that can make those connections. We're looking at some of the micromobility options as being a first mile, last mile connector. And beyond the actual connections, it's things like universal fare systems. You pay your fare once and you use the bus to get to the train or the scooter to get to the train. Any ways to make it easier for the customer to make those connections need to be a part of our strategies.
Absolutely.
Excellent. Thank you so much. The next one, and maybe this is a Brad question. What types of things are being taken into consideration when deciding which project statewide will be submitted for federal discretionary rail funding?
That's a good question. I think
There's a
one
lot
of the things
factors
we
there.
one of the things we know is we're debating this as we speak, actually, because we know that we started off with this discretionary conversation thinking that that they may not want to see the state as the applicant, but as a partner. But we have a limit on, like for Chrissy, we can only do 3 arrays or for the same thing. And then we're also hearing a little bit from the Federal Highway and that they're stretched in capacity and they may like to see state application because of the, just from the perspective of ability to provide oversight, because they're a little stretched. So it's going to be an interesting, I think that this is a little bit to be determined. At the end of the day, I think we're going to be looking for partnerships because regardless of who it comes from, they're not going to want to see projects that are just DOT focused. They're going to want to see projects of regional significance where there's lots of partners involved. We know that they're very interested in safety issues, especially with the number of fatalities we've seen on some corridors. So it's going to depend on the program, and it's going to depend a little bit in terms of how we see the NOFOs coming out, what kind of guidance we get. But one of the things that's really important is that people get out ahead. Like if it's a Chrissy grant and you're looking at it, got to get out early. I mean, we're not very successful when we're throwing grants together at the last minute. So get out early, build the partnerships, and we'll be looking for opportunities to be one of the partners.
That's
Thank
a
you,
great.
Brad.
I was going to say the same thing, that it depends on the grant programs, but there's some kind of core elements that are across the board, and that's those partnerships and kind of the federal priorities. And if we can kind of gauge what those are now, if anybody has interest in partnering, let us know early, and then we can kind of game plan together to figure out our discretionary grant strategy with that in mind and figure out what would be the best grant program to potentially shoot for as a collaborative effort. That increases our chance of success greatly.
All right, very good. Thank you so much. So there are a few questions, and maybe for the sake of time, this one would be our last one. So there are several questions that are being asked about Southwest Florida and other parts of the state, but it's essentially going to the question, what is FDOT doing to improve rail safety? That's kind of the bottom line of all of these topics. So Holly, you want to start, Holly?
Sure. Brad kind of alluded to this a moment ago that, we've been working with some of our corridors where we know there's safety considerations that have become an issue. We do some analyses all the time, just trying to figure out where those incidents are occurring, where those incidents are occurring in any sort of repetitive fashion. Those are the ones we definitely want to make sure we're addressing. If there's an engineering issue, anytime we've got kind of a major incident that happens, a lot of times we'll send out our rail safety inspectors. They're out all the time. So they may be going to assist the Federal Railroad Administration. They may be going out on behalf of, just to kind of initially get some feedback on kind of what's the situation on the ground. There may be some people from our engineering offices, our traffic ops offices that go out after an incident and kind of do a quick after action report, figure out, okay, well, we kind of got, you know, our law enforcement partners, we've got some partners from the railroad operator, if applicable. Let's go out and look at the incident site together, figure out, okay, we know what kind of the components of the incident were. Let's figure out, could we have an engineering solution that might reduce a confusion factor? Or do we know that the signal timing leads to vehicles queuing across the tracks? Can we potentially address that with changing some signal timing? There's some kind of quick things that we can change that we do all the time on kind of an ongoing basis. That's something that we do ongoing. We also try to do some grade separations where appropriate if we know some of these crossings might be redundant and really just, they don't impact accessibility. If we try to do a grade separation, avoid those conflicts altogether. That's an expensive solution, but it's appropriate in certain areas. There's kind of an ongoing program. I mentioned all the safety fixes that happen with the Section 130 program. There's huge benefits for upgrading signal systems, adding more active systems. So that's instead of just your passive kind of crossbucks and things like that, where you actually have flashing lights, you have gates, you have quad gates, you have kind of blocking the traffic in all directions rather than kind of an easy access. Oh, I could just go around the gates if I, you know, feel like I'm safe. No, we want to make sure we can try to protect the public however possible. If there's areas where there's kind of a skewed crossing, maybe we've got additional delineators actually in the crossing to say, hey, please don't confuse this, you know, section of track with roadway, don't turn into here. There's a lot of those kind of engineering side, education side. We've got a whole huge slew of social media and kind of public announcements we did with the Operation Stride dynamic envelope installation. I mentioned we installed over 600 of those in what, like a year and a half. It was a huge initiative to kind of increase that awareness for vehicle users. And a lot of that goes back to targeting areas where we know there are areas of rail safety concern. That's the analysis I was talking about. We go back and kind of find out where those hotspots are. We can target some of those areas and just make sure we've got that messaging on our dynamic envelopes. Hey, we've got these new things out here. When we have Rail Safety Week, we can have some, you know, C-Tracks, Think Train messaging. There's so many different opportunities. We've got, with Operation Lifesaver, it's actually kind of a unique situation, but we actually have the Operation Lifesaver is a nonprofit dedicated to rail safety, but we have the state coordinator actually embedded in FDOT to kind of help serve that need. And we provide additional support, technical support. So it's kind of a unique aspect where we can provide that additional feedback. We've got representatives from the freight railroads, passenger railroads. Actually, we added recently law enforcement to that as well to kind of make sure we got that holistic perspective on how do we address the enforcement needs as well, knowing that's a crucial aspect. And it really helps us kind of cover the gambit really on how are we addressing this both from the FDOT perspective and as our technical role to support Operation Lifesaver and other related entities that focus on rail safety. So we're doing a lot, and sometimes it's tough to kind of share that message that we are doing a lot. It's just not always visible. And that's one of the challenges we run into as well, is making sure we share that message. Brad, Liz, anybody want to elaborate on that one?
That was really, I mean, you covered really nicely the things we're working on. I think one of the things that, you know, we do, there's not an easy fix when we talk about rail safety. And it requires a lot of different partners working together, including the railroads and DOT, but also local governments, local law enforcement, our mental health community. We see a lot of suicides, regrettably. A lot of this is results of trespassing, and you know, I hear a lot of times people say, well, this is, you know, people are just making bad decisions, and well, and it, you know, attributing it to human error. At the end of the day, you know, we have an obligation to try to make our transportation system as safe as possible, and so some of the engineering solutions we're going to look at are going to be really, how do we reduce the opportunity to make a bad decision or create that confusion that may lead to a bad decision. So I always, caution people to get caught up in the, attributing it just to human error, because there are things we can do on the engineering side to make our system safer, to reduce the likelihood of somebody making a bad decision. But there are some cases where, and we've seen some high profile ones where people just made really poor decisions. And when you have a train that's going much faster than they're used to, the consequences are far worse. And it's something that really is critically important for us to tackle.
All right, very good. So I think for the sake of time, we'll just end there. I think a lot of great questions and topics, and thank you all very much for your time as well. So with that, back to you, Holly.
Thanks so much, Shantanu. Yeah, I'm glancing through a lot of these questions, and you're right. A lot of these are just good comments. This is amazing. This is perfect. This is exactly why we're here, figuring out where do we go from here, and all of your comments are really appreciated. All right, so let's go ahead to next steps. So, like we mentioned, thanks so much all for your great questions and feedback. I mentioned our general email address that we'll be checking throughout the process. So before we close, if you have any additional thoughts, comments, I'm sure you've been thinking of all kinds of things as we were going through the questions. Please share those with us. That's either the rail or the transit email addresses you see on the screen. Like I just said, we're going to be monitoring these inboxes throughout the regional listening sessions as well. And for the rail side, throughout the duration of the rail system plan update, that's all the way through the end of this calendar year. Like I mentioned, we're going to be updating the rail system plan, and that's a required document, but this input, it really kind of feeds both the rail system plan and that concurrent effort that we just talked about of further refining our statewide passenger rail strategy and that statewide transit strategy. There'll be lots of additional opportunities for input on the rail system plan. I mentioned that we got that statewide webinar that will be after all of the regional listening sessions wrap up. That's another opportunity for that public comment. And then we'll have really kind of a summary of what we've heard, what we heard from the different regions, where we found kind of those overlapping areas of concern are, where some of those needs are that we're hearing, where are those community desires where we think there's going to be some future for freighter, passenger, rail, or transit. What are the kind of key safety and security questions? Where are those kind of areas where we can make it a more attractive mode for travel? There'll be additional opportunities for public input once we have our full draft rail system plan developed. That's when we'll do a formal public comment period, and we'll have a chance to kind of bring all of that comment that we've heard from our one-on-one interviews with our stakeholders, with the railroads, with the shippers, with those kind of key core groups that we work with that have kind of detailed needs. That's why we're here. I didn't mention it before, but we're actually going to have we're going to participate in the MPOAC passenger rail workshop. That's where we kind of touch base with our MPO and TPO partners. It's been a really, really helpful relationship to have that committee that's focused on freight and now passenger rail. So this is perfect timing again for us to kind of continue to get that input from our local planning partners. And at that point, we'll really have a chance for you to review the full refined vision. That includes those kind of strategies, topic areas that we talked about today, defined into more true strategies and recommendations. And that's when we'll have those detailed needs and short and long-term investment plans as well. All right. And could I get next slide, please? With that, we'll go ahead and end on our safety note. We just talked about rail safety. It's a huge aspect of what we're doing every day. And again, highlighting FDOT's efforts is sometimes part of the challenge, but we mentioned Operation Stride. This is a way for us to increase roadway user awareness of that clearance necessary for the trains to safely pass. This is another opportunity for us to just kind of get that awareness out there, that education component. A lot of good input today, like I mentioned. Liz, any closing words for our audience? Same for Brad.
Sorry about that. I just wanted to thank everybody for taking time out of their busy schedules to participate in the listening session this afternoon. And I encourage you to attend any of the listening sessions in your local regions and join us in person to expand on some of the ideas that you've shared with us and that we've shared with you today. Thank you.
Yeah, I just want to thank everybody for participating, and we got a lot of great feedback, a lot of great questions, and like Liz says, if you're able to come to one of the sessions in person, please do so and continue to stay involved with us.
Absolutely. Thank you both. We're still getting some good input flowing in. This has been amazing. Really appreciate all of your input. Really good questions. We'll take all of it into account, and we'll definitely look forward to seeing you soon at our regional listening sessions in person. Thanks, everyone, and have a great afternoon.